Hello, everyone. This is the team from the Natural Law Institute. We're having this is a Thanksgiving Day special. For some reason, we thought it would be fun to have, because most of us celebrate in the afternoon. So I thought I would have a morning staff meeting and celebrate the holiday. We've been sitting here teasing each other for the past few minutes, or past 15 minutes, 10 minutes, which is part of the ritual. I mean, staff meetings should always start with reciprocal masculine humor and shit talking and all those, right? I mean, that's how you set the stage for a proper meeting, isn't it? I learned that somewhere.
It's how to get on people's good side so you can make them feel bad later, not below baseline.
And then we're supposed to make them feel good at the end. So I think
Yes.
it's shit sandwich.
We always miss that part.
All right. So there's a lot going on right now in the world, so much that it's like, okay, let's drink from the fire hose. But am I wrong, or is it just more interesting to live in the interesting time? I mean, there's a lot going on. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? It's better than listening to a constant stream of woke bullshit from news and the government and the academy, right? I mean, seeing all this chaos go on in the world. Am I wrong? That's more interesting?
We've discussed this in a bunch of ways, but we've exhausted the medium of screen exchange, so now we're being returned to social commons.
Say that again. We've exhausted the means of...
People don't want to watch Netflix and movies over and over again. They're done with that. We've exhausted this medium. So now we're going back into the social commons and we're realizing, holy fuck, we don't get along here.
It's actually true, isn't it?
Yes.
The pandemic used up all of the access screen time.
Yes.
Just burned it off.
It. Smart.
I found I just turn, like when I'm working here, because I can't get this, like earlier in the day, I can work if there's like a lecture or interview playing, right? And then some parts of the day I can only handle music because I can't hear words or I can't concentrate. But usually late at night when I'm just reading papers, like yesterday, I found that I can put Hulu on because it's all shit movies, right? But it's all the good shit movies, like action movies and the thrillers and the horror movies and the, it's all the B movies. And it's like, oh, B movies, that's like background noise. And so Hulu's become my new favorite screen time. And you're right, you can't watch. And the thing is that there's everything you watch is so woke. It's anything new that's produced is so woke. It's offensive. So,
I listen to our guys at 2 times speed in the background all the time.
Yes.
Which makes me more irritated with people who work at regular speed in real life. So everyone knows that I have to struggle through that.
I found that I'm starting to speak faster again, and despite trying not to, because right, but it's like, well, I don't know who I'm talking to, right? If I was talking to us, I'd rather talk faster, but I don't know how followable anything is,
Yes.
So it's hard to tell. Did two other things recently. Did a short one, a 1 hour one with Brad on decidability this week podcast.
I watched them.
And I did one with this guy who questioned me about this graph published in Nature about cannabis use. It's largely as a therapy for ADHD. And I thought those were really fun. Single topic type things. Though what I got of the decidability is that I'm like, well, this is really something you prepare for and organize. I thought I didn't want to repeat the slides before, and I'd just do it ad hoc, but I probably should have done it more organized. But anyway, interviewing the guy on ADHD and cannabis was a lot of fun because he asked really basic questions that were smart. Like, I don't really understand what a distribution, right? I don't understand what correlation means, right? And so it took way longer for me to get that across because I didn't realize the assumptions.
Could you
People-
explain to them what you can't derive from the graph?
Yes,
How long it took?
right. I mean, it was hard to say. Look, you can't make a second order derivation from a single axis correlation, right? You just can't do it. What I really wanted to do was see if I could get across to him the idea of how the brain works, and it worked.
Yes.
That was, for me, that was the goal for myself. I mean, can I help the guy? But I want to get across, can I communicate how simple the structure of the brain is so that people understand these things and they stop being mystical or whatever. And I think that most people, once, if they're anywhere on the spectrum or the cognitive, the non-neurotypical spectrum, I'm not sure I'm not even sure that exists anymore. They're outside the large distribution of the neurotypical spectrum. I find that if they know what's going on, it's self-forgiving. Right? And so that's that's what I wanted to see if I could do for him. It was just peace for me, which was understanding if I could do it. And the peace for him was, could I make him feel like this was not a problem? And then the reach was, can I make people understand that given the computational division of labor, right, the sense perception division of labor, is that we need people that are outliers, right? So while your particular, this is what I say, so if being normal is easy for you, but is it good for man? I don't know. Being an outlier, is that hard for you, but is it good for mankind? Well, obviously the answer is yes. The absurd classification of that is, why do we need people who are immoral? Because otherwise evolution would have no means of tracking, preserving the instinct to crush immorality, right? So we have, it's all these we forget that there are positive and negative boundary conditions. And under some cases, the crazy uncle is really valuable. And the chick who will, what do you call it? The chick with the green hair or the purple hair and the tattoos who has low impulse control, always reproduces, that has some value too. I look at Luke and I'm looking at him smiling because he's thinking of all the purple hair girls he slept with.
No, I am not.
You'd rather not think about them.
I got one in there, and nobody beat me to the punch this time. That's awesome. I get a point today. I give myself a point for sneaking one in.
Once in a holiday.
What?
I pay at least enough. I pay at least enough attention to recognize that the brightly colored animals are dangerous.
Oh shit!
No, as you were describing that, we really don't want it to be true, but ease is not the ideal state for humans, for any living organism, right? We really don't want that to be true, but it's true. We need pressures on us in order to stimulate, in order for us to maximize our genetic expression. It won't emerge in any other way.
We might want it to be easy.
Right.
Right. Although as some guy who's retired like 4 times, I tried to retire 4 times. Clearly I've been retired since what? And I'm not retired. I have a full-time fucking job with this stuff, right? So as a guy who's retired 4 times, you can get away, you feel good about it for about 90 days. And after that, it's like, I need some shit fucking work to do. This is not okay. Because it starts to make you sad. At least for me. I mean, I guess there are people who can, get high and watch MTV all day or something, but it's not
not without developing depression. They can't.
Yeah, that's the right answer.
Well, that's the thing is we've gotten so far away from the healthy expression of even things like our emotions, like fear and stuff like that, right? That we don't even know how to navigate them anymore, so they become dysfunctional.
Yes. It's the problem of mothering.
Well, the mainstream is telling us that feeling certain emotions is bad in itself.
Right. Where most of those emotions are saying, I need to adapt. Right? That's what they're saying. And so you're saying I don't want to adapt, which is saying I don't want to do work, right? I mean, well then, you're a snail, for Christ's sake. I mean, what's the difference between you and a snail? All the rest of us that are trying to adapt and do the work, we're carrying you snails around, right? It's really quite annoying. Anyway, Luke, you were running with that, and I tried to make.
No, that's why I was smirking as you were talking, is just because we want to pretend like ease is the goal, and ease can't be the goal, or we're dead.
Ease for the people who fail is having people to imitate. That if they imitate them, like, it doesn't harm them.
You were on. You guys have been on this. You and Luke have been on this for a bit, and I think it's brilliant. Because this is it's like I was saying this morning or yesterday. Like, we hit this class thing, right, Luke? We hit this class issue, and it's like, shit, there's more work to do here, right? and it's like, God damn it, I don't want class to have to be an institutional structure, but it has to be an institutional structure for the reasons that Brandon just stated. Is that we keep assuming everybody's the same, but as you move downward, you need to imitate. Now, of course, the midwits don't want to realize that they're imitating the wits, right? And then the nitwits don't want to realize they're imitating the midwits, right? And so on. But smart stuff does trickle downhill. It's also true that smart stuff bubbles up. Like, what's the canonical example? The kid who figured out he could attach this bar to this thing going around on a steam engine, and it could collect pay while the machine did all the work. It was a steam engine or mill, I can't remember. It'll come to me in a bit, but it's like, okay, well, that bubbled upward, right? I mean, stuff does bubble up from the craftsman on up, right? I mean, it does, but so that's a specific, right? And the general does trickle down and through imitation. But we forget that everybody's doesn't have equal access to putting a craftsman's detail in a context that can be generalized, nor does everybody have access to the generalization that allows a general concept to be applied to an increasingly diverse set of particulars. Did that make sense the way I said it?
And imitation is a stage of development. It's not a place you stay or stuck or an endpoint, right? I mean, one of the things I think we pay a heavy cost for since we've industrialized education, right? We've sent all the kids out of the home, is all of the people that would otherwise be in that home have lost the experience of these kids imitating them and copying them and following them around and going, what's that, and doing the same things they're doing, right? And how that's part of the development. It's not a negative. That's part of the development process. That's how you start to internalize those experiences and learn from those experiences by copying how you're seeing other people navigate them.
Let's run with that, because that's really smart concept. Is that what you're saying is you never fully reach adulthood without having to have the self-regulation to ensure your children against your dysregulation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Because what happens is, if you don't produce the self-regulation to ensure your children against your dysregulation. Now, not only are you infecting them with dysregulation, you're not using your ability of self-regulation to assist the children in their own self-regulation. So it's this cascading problem of generations. And we throw this under this self-regulation under the umbrella of responsibility. And sure, right? I mean, we know that, like, IQ or intelligence, and excuse me, this is not correct. I should always put conscientiousness first and intelligence second. We know that conscientiousness and intelligence together decrease the number of accidents you have. Like in every aspect, like poking yourself with a needle, burning yourself on something, right? Tripping over something, forgetting something, having a car accident, right? It doesn't make any difference. We know that intelligence and conscientiousness, which are the basic prerequisites for self-regulation, we know those things vary across the spectrum, and that's largely the difference in class, right? Those two things. And we know that that's why you have more problems as we move down through the classes, because at some point you're not only incapable of your own self-regulation, but you're incapable of functioning as the self-regulation for your offspring. And this is what produces, of course, the need, which is what we sort of touched on this week, is shit. We need institutions that assists in class formation, in class, insisting in class adaptation.
We could just stop grouping them together in groups that don't adapt at all. I mean, why are you putting all the people that are the same age at the same developmental level together when there's nothing to learn from one another?
Really frustrating, honestly. I mean, I find normals frustrating.
They're not even at the same developmental level. They're just
right. Yeah, they're well, which means they're dragging one another down.
That's
Because
right.
they're not at the same developmental level, but they are all the same age, so they're creating an imitable.
So let's get to the root
example.
cause, right? Your mom doesn't want her kid to be in, if there are 6 levels of classes. Mom doesn't want her kid to be in the first 3 levels, right? And so mom pressures the school system for this, when that's probably the wrong way of looking at it. It's that we all develop at different rates. A 30-year-old 90 IQ black male approaches the functionality of a 17-year-old Asian male, right? But they get there. You know what I mean? These are developmental differences in our rate of adaptation, but you can get most people there if they're not subject to some sort of trauma, or in this case. So isn't the problem that the class structure doesn't provide you a success vehicle? In other words, the absence of one. There's no success vehicle where you can be proud of meeting this criteria for your class, right? You can't claim that, because the way we set it up now, if you're not middle class or upper middle class, you're a fucking loser.
Well, it gives the students at the bottom, their criteria is that we are here with you. That's the criteria that they use to measure up. That's why they're top.
I can sense there are a couple possibilities, but I can't figure out exactly what you're saying.
We're discussing, when you put people together, how it pulls down the mean of the group, because you're including people who are dysfunctional with the functional people, and what you want to do is pull the people who are extremely functional, I mean, mature for their age, through the maturation faster, because they show the ability to do so.
The technical, the procedural way of looking at is you have to dumb things down to the average in a classroom, which they say is utilitarian. But what's really happening is you're depriving the upper half of the ability to accelerate it. And so what we're seeing, and we're seeing this all across we're seeing a decline in demonstrated intelligence and a decline in demonstrated competitive or adversarial value worldwide.
Do people make that mistake all the time? Seeing something that is seeing something to be useful, utilitarian, because it's universal and ideal?
Well, that's an industrial age, and it's an equalitarian truth, right? Those are presumptions of a good under the feminine left mind, and it somewhat was part of the conservative and progressive movements, which were both designed to say, well, we can make people better like we make machines. Doesn't work, of course. Whereas instead, at least when I was in school, there were six levels, right? And I was in 5 or 6, right? I don't know why I got into 5 and 1. Probably because I wasn't paying attention. It's too boring or something. There's 5 or 6 levels, and you get in the 5th or 6th level, and that's what you go. But I mean, even then, what's the difference? If I was a year later, I would have been more, and a year younger, I would have been less. And you see that happening in schools all the time, where you really ought to hold boys an extra year if you can, if you want them to do better than school. And in Finland, it's not common to hold them till they're 7 instead of 5. And that's my understanding. I haven't looked at the data recently, so it might be 2010 or whatever, but that's my understanding. So, boys get there more slowly than girls. Why? Because girls are more, they want to serve better, more, please, right? And they're more verbal, whereas boys need 2 more years to get to the same level of verbal acuity and desire to order, the order. And so you see these things happening. Well, we put all the kids together, and then you make it so that the boys don't get the amount of physical exercise, because they're afraid of children being hurt, right? And what happens, of course, or the cost of having the extracurricular, the outside activity. I mean, we used to get in fights and everything else out there, right? But we were always playing some sport or another, and they take that away, and all of a sudden you've got girls becoming selfish, and guys, in other words, they lack teen consciousness, and boys becoming developmentally delayed because of the relationship between physical action and cognitive development. So we're doing all these things wrong, as from what I understand, is the feminine maternal instinct to produce equality on one hand, and in other words, to not bear the costs of social pressure under inequality and status quo. It's really not that they want equality; it's that they fear inequality. They don't want to bear the costs of it, and so you see this ripple through the education system, and then you see it scale into what we see as woke, right? Which is 3 years brain. So it's just horrible what's going on. But these are all telling you, don't mature, don't adapt, don't pay the costs. When, as Luke said, what does stress mean? It means you're learning. That's all it means. What you're trying to do instead is provide the sufficient stress that it's interesting or even challenging, but that you don't fail. And so the trick then in education or any kind of institution is to subject the people to stress within the sufficient to maximize the stress that doesn't cause them to fail, right? That's really what it is, which is the opposite. Which, I mean, what Nassim Taleb has been saying, he's just saying it differently, right? Is build in anti-fragility. Well, yes. It's just neural adaptation. So Luke, I saw the smile there, so I thought you might want to run with something.
Well, we've observed many times in the past how having children changes the level of responsibility that a female will display, right?
Yes.
And I one of the other, I think, costs we're paying because of how we've structured education is, as those younger girls are developing, they're not spending that time around younger kids, getting that same stimulus, getting that same stress of the younger kids, and having to adapt to it. So they don't even get to start that process until they reach adulthood and start having their own children, when they should be starting that process, throughout their entire developmental process. They should be experiencing those kind of pressures, so that adaptation begins much earlier than we're seeing it begin now.
So there's the physical and spatial cognizance and somewhat teen cognizance on the male side, but there's a different kind of teen cognizance on the female side. And what's happening is we're delaying their exercise, just like we're delaying physical exercise or cognitive exercise. We're delaying their exercise. So where the energy goes to solipsism, basically, right. Instead of the energy going to what is that younger kid feeling, and how can I regulate that feeling? And in order to do that, I have to learn to regulate myself.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And I see evidence of that. My family does homeschools, right? So we spend a lot of time with other homeschool families, and I see that distinction very clearly in girls of the same age from the homeschool communities versus the public school or the educational system communities. And that's the big distinction I see, is their ability to demonstrate responsibility. It becomes less and less mimicry and more them doing it, but because they're exposed to those stresses. There's a really good friend of ours. They've got 8 kids, and their oldest is, I think, 14, and it's this girl, and she's one of the most responsible kids of her age that I've ever seen. And when I've seen her interact, she spends a lot of time in that care state, or in that care role with her younger siblings, and she's been in that state for years now, because she's the oldest of 8 kids, right? And so you can see the effects it's having, just as one example, right? But I see this with a lot of kids her age in the circles that we run in. They exhibit the same traits, and so I think that by chunking kids up into grades, right, we're really, I think we're causing easily as much harm to females as we are to males.
Yes,
right? You're talking about ADHD. That's we're slamming males into an environment that's dysfunctional for them. So of course they're going to exhibit dysfunctions. The same thing is true about females. We're slamming them into an environment that's dysfunctional for them, and it is retarding their development.
Right, it makes them sexually antisocial.
Yeah.
So you just said so many points there. I'm trying to keep track of them, like as a card file as you're going through them, and I'm like, there's no way I can both listen and keep track at this point. The key thing I want to bring, I guess I want to draw to that, I could summarize the narrative I can construct is you educate us as a society, not as a class. In other words, you want to have a spectrum of ages.
Oh yes, yeah.
Right. That's, I think, and we can see it in a construct like homeschooling, where it's just natural. But we can also see it if we look at tribal societies, where the 6-year-old girl is watching the 2-year-old baby, right? And the 9-year-old girl is watching the 6-year-old girl and the baby, and they're all sort of keeping track together like hens, right? I mean, and the boys, God knows what they're doing, right? I mean, they're off there causing chaos and hitting things with sticks and whatever. But you see it there, and what's happening is we're exercising neural development.
Yeah.
So what I'm worried about, what I want to ask you guys about, or at least I want to make sure we talk about to illustrate it, is this another problem, like people believe there's an innate, in other words, the equivalent of our nature or our genetics manufacture us according to a plan, versus that we have different biological probabilities, and we have to train ourselves into these probabilities, right? And so some of these probabilities are obvious, like empathizing versus systematizing, right? The need to feel inclusion, the fear of exclusion, the need to acquire, right? And the demand for reciprocity and proportionality. I mean, those are simple, basic needs, and we all vary in how we interpret those. And we also vary somewhat in competency, but that's not an infinite number of variables. But then those variables need a structure to mature within, right? I mean, they're just biases to learning. So I just wondered, what do people think, that people's nature is whatever they intuit? What is it? Where are people getting this idea that a child doesn't need training? No, we call it education. What's the difference between education and training? Well, training is at least the concept that it's not so much voluntary, and education is a little more voluntary and abstract. But is there really any difference? I don't, technically intuition, when you're doing a training, you're affecting intuition, and when you're doing education, you're affecting reason. Right? That's a technical difference, right? But I mean, don't all humans need training? I think you need training before you can have education.
You should get it before you need it. It's easier to push physical limits with a child before their mental limits. I mean, other than frustration, meaning they don't have a logical paradigm to work upon. You're not exactly dealing with reason at first. So you exhaust physical limits first. You teach them that your body is going to say no and you can say yes, right?
Yeah, but where is this crazy fucking idea coming from? You know, where is this idea that your nature need only blossom?
Oh, I just see it as reinforced dysfunction, right? In a supercharged, like, social arena.
Is it just responsibility of age?
I see feminine instincts that they don't want to stress the kids with training. And
Well, they
of
don't have
course,
responsibility for it. Or we've
Yeah.
taken away the negative consequences for a mother's irresponsibility is probably closer to it if I try to think how the female
We've
mind.
afforded risk to be framed as bad as opposed to necessary, like physical risk as worse. You're saying that they want to sit the kids down so they don't get hurt. It's like, well, actually, you'd rather someone get physically hurt, like because they were playing, than make them all dysfunctional by keeping them sitting.
and then of course there's the enemy saying training children into adults is an Autorian personality or something.
Mhm. What they mean is, okay, it all comes back to the female.
But the other element in play in there is we mentioned a bunch of times in here is these expressions come within upper and lower limits. But if you refuse to recognize limits, then those upper and lower structures can't be in place, right? So everybody can achieve this ideal because there are no limits.
Well, it's just again a false equality, right?
Right. Yeah.
Well, I mean,
That's their
It's-
mindset though. Is it points towards an ideal that's an achievable ideal rather than a general achievable ideal rather than a specific ideal for each individual based on their genetic expression
it's like
or within the limits of their genetic
so
expression.
here's tell me. I realize I have low empathizing, high systematizing. I realize all my own weaknesses and understanding. But you know, if I want to play volleyball, when I play volleyball, I have to play. There's teams that are 5'8" and under, and 5'7", and there are teams that are 5'8" and over. Right? I mean, if you're 5'8" and over, your chances of doing better. But so I don't mind playing against the 5'8" and under guys like me. Right? It's not a problem. Right? But I don't want to play. My cousin's over 6 feet. You know, he can just go, and his arms are like they don't go to his ankles. Right? So it's like it just puts his hand up in the air, and it's like I can't even jump as high as his hand can reach. Right? So I'm trying to be funny here, but it's true.
It's funny to me.
Well, you're the same height as I am.
It's like what Peterson always used to bring up about big rat having to let the small rat win at least
Yes.
30% of the time.
Yes.
Otherwise, the small rat would refuse to play.
Well, it's just not
Yeah.
fun anymore.
Well, fairness isn't outcomes. Fairness is proportionality. Is fairness.
Yes.
We frame it wrong. Just like we use ideals instead of optimums. It's like, yeah, well, you'd like to be that, but you can't.
That you should enumerate those three ideals versus optimums.
Optimums.
And
Sure.
then the other one was, what was the one before it?
Oh, what were we talking about? Height?
Yeah, I lost it. You had two there, and I intuited the third, and I went and revisited. Now I lost it. All right. So there's a couple of dimensions here. We have the female instinct. We have the left wing justification of it, right, for equality. We have the capture of the institutions by the female method. We have the lack of development because of this, and we have the social, political, and economic consequences of this educational, this failure of training, really. And so what solutions have we found? Which is you need to put people. You need to keep society. I don't know what's the substitute for a class. You want to build a society, right? And so that, you know, the thing I like about one-room schoolhouses or whenever I like being younger and able to listen to the lesson the older kid had.
A generation should be the substitute for a class.
Yeah, I think that's probably the right way of looking at it. And so, And so you have that. The second thing is that groups mature at different rates because of neotenic differences in racial origin. Right? So there's a different rate there. And within groups, we have different self-regulation, right? Which is they don't want to hear it as genetic load, but I mean it's rates of neural adaptivity because of the randomness of genetic production. The number of polygenic traits that are involved, right? So you have the way you solve this is you say we group people into generations or something like that. We keep classes of people admixed, right? And to some degree, we separate groups by their rate of development. Is that what it is? Do we go back to 1 to 6 different, which is about right? So 6 seems about the right number of, let's see, septiles, whatever. And then how do we remove the stigma? In other words, I see the problem as stigma, right? Is that one is that we don't treat everybody as only needing to be successful within their limits, right? By treating everybody, we make people fail. Right? The second thing is we don't define a class structure as a thing. And secondly, we don't teach people that, well, we all get there pretty much. We just get there over shorter and longer periods of time, and there's no, it's just a roll of the dice, and therefore we respect one another. Right? You respect people within their rank, not people according to an ideal. Does that make sense? So is that possible to restore that ethic in education and training? In other words, can we, because it's simply true, right? I mean, we can create the institution and the method, but we've got to create the ethic or the norm. So can we create that norm?
It's easiest if you politically enfranchise the family as the smallest unit of political inclusion. Because you have to remain in the societal and familial context outside of your schooling.
So we have to shift from the leftist emphasis of the individual's maximum consumption back to the first institution of family as the purpose of policy and the production of intergenerational. And that's different from ostracizing people, which is what they're afraid of. We don't want to ostracize people if they want to check out of society, right? But we say it's different from organizing society specifically for the benefit of intergenerational family. Right? So it's possible to do. I mean, is this I always think of what's the Schoolhouse Rock, which was the best it's the best bit of education I think I've ever seen is Schoolhouse Rock. If the audience doesn't know it, just go search it, and you can learn everything about the Constitution of and grammar and all sorts of stuff by these little music. And I'm like, how did they reduce that much importance to a bunch of songs? It's fucking genius. But the thing about that is a public service. It's a public service. To me, you could put that public service out, right, and just buy airtime on shows until we say this is how the world really is, and everybody's got to do their duty, right? Which then gets away from doing your duty is to each other, and that gets away from be all you can be, right? Which turns out is destructive. Does that make sense? So it's not impossible to get across what we want to get across, which is true. I'm watching Luke here because he's intimately involved in this kind of thing, and I'm not getting a negative response. So
it's not impossible.
What?
It's not impossible.
I think aside from removing that stigma, we should also have a stigma against hubris of pretending to be, or that your kids are more capable than they really are.
Tying this back to the problem India is going through right now. Great complimented American sociologist working in Australia who specializes in India, which is a very interesting combination. But he's saying that the problem with of the Indian perception of Western academics, public intellectuals, and media is that we all outside of India get information through a fairly limited number of academics and think tanks in India, right? And those people have a set of biases, right? And it turns out that, you know, the people in India keep getting frustrated because we keep rating India as very low on the democracy scale, which seems really weird to me. Because India has some laws that prohibit, you know, like they prohibit certain freedom of speech, even though they're never fucking exercised. Right? He's saying we've had 4 people in Australia prosecuted for freedom of speech, free speech, you know, as something kind of impolitic speech, right? Of which 2 probably might have been right, but even where they're right, it's just because they're state actors and they shouldn't be engaging in that kind of discourse as a representative of the state, right? He says India has 50 times Australia's population, and you have 2, and they're also only criticized because they're state actors, and as state actors, they shouldn't be expressing a public opinion which is interpreted behind the state. So how can India's democrat, you know, this is an example. If we look, this is just one example of many similar. So how can we claim India has a worse condition because they have a law that's never fucking applied, right? It doesn't really, in other words. So this tends to be a lot of what he's getting at is very nicely saying. There's a lot of circle jerking going on.
Because it's demonstrably settled among the Indian people.
Yeah, it's like, so like the problem again is Modi, right? Now Modi hasn't been elected and he's a nationalist. I am trying not to take this, I'm only trying to make an example here, right? But Modi's a nationalist and he's a Hindu nationalist. He speaks to Indians in religious or more, what they consider moral terms, the way, let's say, conservatives speak to Americans in moral terms. And she says, well, yeah, but you have all these left-wing, she uses a lot of pejoratives, and he corrects her every time she uses a pejorative. The interviewer uses pejorative, which is kind of funny. But I mean, like she would say cult or something along that line. And, you know, and he would say, well, people all have biases. He's too fucking American. But anyway, so she's saying, but why do Americans intellectuals criticize? I mean, because the people that we're talking to, who talk about India, are speaking in something that's translatable in English or in English, and it's from these these primary intellectuals. But these primary intellectuals have an agenda, right? And so the West is not. Just, well, you guys have the left; it does the same thing to you, and we're like, exactly, right? And so, he was trying to make the point that if you're in India, what you see is different from what we say outside of India, because in India they call it Bharat, right? And which is the name of the Indian continent in their own language, which is Sanskrit. So they don't. So if you put Bharat on there, nobody in the West is going to even read beyond the title. Right? I mean, it's so obvious, right? And they're not even going to read beyond the title because all of a sudden you're using context specific rather than context neutral language, which is incomprehensible. That's on top of the fact that Indian culture is fucking incomprehensible anyway, right? I mean, it's just complicated. So it's like, okay. So why did I go off on that tangent? There was a reason I went down.
The overarching thread we've been working on is class.
Thank you. So India, thank you. I love you. So the thing about India is they have this class system. And it's amazing how well it works. What is it missing? It's missing class rotation. That's
Right.
different caste and class. But otherwise, you can get in the West, we used to have, I mean, if you look at the Domesday Book, right? My ancestors have their rank, sergeant, corporal, right, whatever it was, captain, underneath their name in the fucking map. Right? Right. So you had a rank. Even if you were just a right, you would be a private, right? I mean, if you weren't in a rank, that said something about you, right? But in a rank, you only have certain duties. So in a class, you only have certain duties, but in what do duties mean? Responsibilities. So I just think it's unfair to make people this whole promise of the Enlightenment, which is an aristocracy of everyone, is the same thing as a false promise of equality of everyone.
But I think that it got the experiment. I think got co-opted or taken over. Right? I think the intent was an aristocracy accessible to everyone, not rather than an aristocracy of everyone. Right? I think for a class system to become an institution, you want it to be, or you need it to be rigid enough to support the social order, but you need it to be permeable enough to allow the social order to adapt.
Right.
It has to have those two traits. If you look at India, it's not permeable. Their caste system is not permeable enough, and you see their society not adapting because of that.
Their castes are so genetically distinct, they're effectively races.
Right. They're effectively different ethnicities at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah. My dad's wife, before he passed, she's from India. She was born in India. She's from upper class in India, and it was.
How did he get a fancy girl?
Well, that's kind of.
All right, we won't talk about that in public.
There's other dysfunctions in there, right? But she was a pretty cool lady. But that's why I got to spend quite a bit of time with her, learning about how their systems work and stuff like that. And we were at just to give you a little story here, we were at a Indian restaurant one time, and it was staffed by native Indians, right? People that had migrated over to the U.S. here. Right? They were living in Texas at the time, and she was treating the staff like crap from the American perspective, right? She was just talking to them in ways that just it wouldn't be socially acceptable here, right?
Yes.
The way that the interactions were occurring. And I was asking her about, I was calling her on it. I'm like, how does that work? Because this seems, for me, this seems like a very awkward exchange, very, I wouldn't approach it that way. So tell me what's going on here. And she's like, okay, well, watch. So the wait staff comes back out again. She turns really nice and starts talking really nicely to them and very, very considerate and, being very kind to them. And 2 minutes later, the owner of the restaurant was out trying to figure out what was wrong. Was the meal bad? Did the wait staff make some huge mistake or something like that? She's like, see, if we don't demonstrate the appropriate class distinctions, they're going to think something's wrong. I'm failing on my end if I'm not behaving in the appropriate way in these exchanges, as much as they could be failing on their end. So it's part of the dynamic that's in play there. Is you have to these roles become ingrained, like you said, they're genetic, but they're also, when they're not being observed, it creates an externalized cost on the exchanges as well, right? And it was just such a stark demonstration on the spot, intentional demonstration on the spot of this dynamic that occurs specifically in India, but it was wild to watch it happen. That she could turn it off and on and off and just show me this is how it works. I'll show you exactly how it works by turning it on and off, and it did exactly what she said it was going to do.
No, but it's true. We do it in the Anglosphere largely by language.
Yeah.
To use different terms. I know that if I want to assert my status, I just change my voice, demeanor, and vocabulary. And you get a different reaction out of people, right? The same way, like, you can command some difference of authority and respect. Whereas if you don't have all that, you don't know how to use the demeanor and language, it doesn't matter, right? I mean, it won't affect you. But the trick is knowing what the difference is between complaint and order, right? I mean, you're just issuing an order. You're going to take this as funny as a Marine, but I was in an airport and they were mishandling the luggage. I tell this story pretty often. And I said, do your fucking job, soldier. This is how this is handled. This is how it's done, whatever. And the black guy stands back and he's like, you must be, you guys, you must be a Marine. You guys are always giving orders. Right? I mean, because there's a right fucking way to do things, right? And he's obviously a soldier, right? Navy or Army or something. And he understands what military voice is. And, the hand signal. Do you have the hand signal down, Luke? The hand signal? This hand signal?
Yeah.
This is how it's done.
Right.
This way, that way. So,
Actually, I actually had to train myself away from it a bit because I used to do quite a bit of presenting in front of corporate audiences and stuff like that, and that doesn't fly as well in that setting.
No, but with other soldiers, it does.
Yes,
like I've said that to a cop. What's your problem, soldier? Right, and it changes instantaneously because what you've done is you've said, okay, it's that kind of relationship, right? And it's not oppressive; it's just information.
Right.
It's information. Okay, he's going to operate by this principle, and therefore I can operate by this principle. So the thing about that I like about Indian and European is that they made their class system and its duties a mirror of the military hierarchy and its duties. Right? And in Europe, the European civilization, until fairly recently, we all had ranks. And you actually wanted a rank. It's better to be a private than just a freeman. And it's better to be a freeman than a serf. And it's better to be a serf than a slave. So this is the hierarchy. The difference is that you don't expect a private to do more than a private is able to be responsible for. You don't expect a lieutenant to do more, a sergeant, a lieutenant, all the way up to captain. You don't expect them. I'm kind of disappointed at majors in general. I don't know what. I think we ought to get rid of that rank because that seems like a losing proposition across the spectrum. I don't know. Did I get a laugh out of that one? I don't know. I expect it. There's not enough military guys in the audience to. Major is like the Peter principle. It's where it's above captain, which is like the most competency that's possible, and after that, you're a politician. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just being.
It's an interesting rank where you've passed all of the demonstrable merit criteria, and now you're the low man again on the leadership merit criteria. So
I like Dilbert principle where people are promoted up from positions where they could do damage.
Yes. Anyway, I'm sure the soldiers.
That's how we should be viewing credentials.
Yes. Well, okay. So I don't want to get. I blew it by taking it too many examples. But the point is that what I like about the German education system, for example, is it makes you successful at some rank. Right? You have rotation capacity, which is fantastic. But their goal is to make sure you're minimally successful, right? By making sure you're maximally successful within a rank. And I just love that system because people feel taken care of. But if you do what we do, which is this utopian Christian French nonsense that we've got in our country, inherited in our country, which is that you say you can be upper middle class, you're setting everybody up to fail. And it's no wonder they're resentful, because they're thrown into the meat grinder of the market without the skills to compete in it and without the knowledge of what criteria for success is. So how does that tie into education? It's the same fucking thing. So the only question is, how do we overcome this cult, which is both the Enlightenment cult of, would you say, the aristocracy of everyone, the availability of the aristocracy to everyone has become the promise of the aristocracy, an aristocracy of everyone. And conversely, the promise of equality of opportunity, which is the same thing as of access to aristocracy versus achieving it. It means that we are in fact equal, and we promised equality of outcome. I mean, there's these set of lies, both from the middle class and from the feminine underclass method. These are, oh, wait a minute, I forgot the third one. You always got to have 3 points to make a line. And then, of course, the oppression narrative that we're all capable of fucking glory and wonderful wealth because we're all intrinsically evil. That snuck out there. Equal in ability, and therefore we're oppressed by prohibition from this system. So you have the false promise of the aristocracy, the false promise of equality of outcome, and the false claim of oppression. And we have to get rid of all three of those in order to bring about what really is a set of institutions that facilitate what we think of as class, but more might better think of as rank. So, trying to bring Luke's back into
it's hierarchy. Either way, it's hierarchy. So,
right. Well, I don't know.
There's 3 marketplaces, of each of which is a hierarchy. Yeah, and lower class they specialize in care. In the middle class, they specialize in production. In the upper class, they specialize in asset handling and defense.
Organization.
All right, so
I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to think about it that way. Is that of course, I don't mind. Right, a hierarchy is comforting to me because it means my responsibility is limited. That's how I see hierarchy. I don't. Right. But how does the person at the bottom see hierarchy? Do they see it as oppression? How do they see it? They see it as, because there's like the working class in England thinks they're heroic, right? They don't have a negative opinion,
right? Because they're not at the bottom; they're at the foundation. There's a place. There's a place below that. The hierarchy inverts and points downwards as well as to a point, just like it points up to a point.
They're the foundation. That's
the midpoint. The widest point is the foundation.
Yeah. The parasitic elite sell the dysfunctional the lie that they are adjacent to them.
Yes. That's like, it's all this false promise that's the problem, right? Yeah. Every false promise is an impediment to a truth that would serve the public interest.
And in Juvenalian terms, the working class is in the middle. The new migrants are the bottom.
Yeah. Well, it's like, who was I talking to about the other day? Like, well, why do you consider it oppression when it's just integration? Well, I don't understand why you consider integration oppression. Well, I mean, it's the price of entry, right? I want the benefits without paying the cost of integration. Well, then your cost of non-integration is imposed upon other people. Like, why do you have that right? And people think they have that right. And I'm like, why? Why do you think you have that right? Why do you have the right to access to European civilization, which requires extraordinary psychological and emotional costs? Extraordinary sacrifice, really, to the commons. Why do you think you get to have the gains of that without the returns on it? Because I pay taxes. You don't, though. Actually, if we look at it, you probably don't pay any net taxes. You probably almost certainly consume far more tax revenue than you produce. It's not almost certainly, you certainly do. And the second thing is that you're not paying the tax for the cost of access to that the system, which is full integration. Now, as Luke is fond of trying to beat into my head and everyone else's, there's a difference between tolerance and forbearance. Now, we will forbear, right, which is an investment in your future production, but we're not going to tolerate, we don't tolerate your failure to pay the cost of integration. And so forbearance is an investment, assuming that you're going to produce some returns. Tell me if I get this wrong, Luke.
Yeah, we risk your failure, right?
Yep.
Because that's always possible, even under forbearance. But we're not going to permit you to externalize the cost of those.
Yes.
Of course, people who are pushing for non-integration are the same ones who pushed for immigration of those people in the first place.
Yes.
That was the goal, that they would integrate. If it was up to us, we wouldn't have them here at all.
Yeah. There's a good video that I plan on sharing and doing another piece on, since I'm doing these shorter pieces, the other day, about someone who explains why Central and Eastern Europe aren't woke. And he nails it perfectly. And so I want to use that because the explanatory power of it's very, very powerful, and it correctly insults France, Germany, England, and America, and of course Judea. Correctly insults it for their imperialism, and exposes the negative malincentives of it. And it doesn't do it through whiny bitchiness, or it just does it through historical tradition and how these things develop, which I thought was absolutely choice. So it's a great way of saying, well, woke is not the virtue we say it is. It's actually an oppression. In other words, it's trying to bring it about an oppression upon people, the same way that Germans tried to colonize Eastern Europe and Russians tried to colonize Eastern Europe.
That whole arena of thought ending in woke and so on, that's the only hate crime. It's a religion of hate, and it undermines the family and the division of labor. It's a hate crime.
They can't understand it. Why it's a religion of hate? Because it's a religion of blaming, of externalizing responsibility, right? It's a religion of claim of oppression. But are they being oppressed? How would we tell if you're oppressed?
They can't be held. They can't be
Okay,
held.
that's the. How do we know if you claim you're oppressed? How do you claim you're oppressed? Under what criteria do you claim you're oppressed? And the answer is, of course, is that you're being domesticated, you're being civilized, and you don't want to be, because civilization is the practice of suppressing animal impulses in order to produce a common good. And what you're saying is you want to not adapt. You don't want to not pay the cost of suppressing your impulses. You don't want to pay the cost, especially you don't want to pay the cost of incorporation into whiteness, because whiteness is the most expensive psychologically and emotionally of every and all civilizations, and partly because it requires the most trust and that you behave in the most trustworthy fashion. So the problem is, I can't find anywhere where they're oppressed. You could say that we're taken advantage of by the clerisy and the financial system. You could say those things and be true, and it would be true. I don't know how to get away from that. You could say that we're also oppressed. I said the clerisy, the financial system, and there is a problem with our law and our commerce, in other words, capitalism, and that it allows labor arbitrage, which at the cost of our own people and the exporting of skills. So that's true. So there are complaints, right, about the system, right, which is institutional. But you can complain about education for the reasons we just said. Education is not serving you to participate in a world where the commercial can engage in arbitrage to your disadvantage. The financial can engage in rent seeking against your advantage, and the clerisy can engage in extractions against your advantage. Those are all true, right? But they're also not oppressions. They're failures of us together to fix problems of the commerce, finance, and the clerisy, right? I mean, they're solvable problems.
They're the ones that are pushing the narrative of oppression.
Can you elaborate?
That's true based, again, in Juvenalian terms. We're saying they're oppressed by the high, while the high is telling the low that they're actually oppressed by the middle.
Yes, correct. Well, is the market oppressive? It's demanding.
Well, disambiguate oppression for me.
Well, I mean, that's what I'm trying to do, right? I'm trying to do that by throwing out every example across the spectrum that I can in order to create a pattern that we can say, well, is there any oppression really?
Sometimes you're being punished, sometimes you're being disciplined, sometimes you're being trained, right?
These aren't oppressions.
Oppression
Domestications.
Right. Oppression is the emotional description of limits.
Okay, you've hit on it there. So can you?
So is fascism nowadays.
Right. Yeah. Right. So all limits are artificial. So any limit you experience is oppression.
Okay. And so this goes to all left-wing promises, false promise. All left-wing claims have to do with promises of the possibility of evading the four laws of nature, which is the physical scarcity, behavioral self-interest, really, and evolutionary selection, described by what we call truthful, which is logical reason.
Right.
So they're always promising you can get away from these limits, and when people tell you those limits exist, they're claiming they're oppressing you.
Yes, that is exactly their definition.
It's hate speech.
Yeah.
It takes right. They're generating hate speech. Okay, so what's so funny, Brandon? The irony of it all.
That it's hate speech to tell them that they can't have things that they can't produce. I know, that's just a limit. I mean, to me, it always comes down to, like, they want things that they can't have, but even if we were to try to restitute the damages that they cause, we couldn't. That's what it means to be a dependent. Like, if you act up and cause harm, I can't get what you've caused in harm back from you because you're that worthless. So what are we supposed to do? There's no worth there. You have to blame the people who are disorienting and making those the people at the bottom dysfunctional, because they're dysfunctional people without limits. Just like children are dysfunctional without limits.
Yeah, but okay, so let's ask a deeper. Wait a minute, Luke, did I interrupt you?
No.
Okay. So let's ask the next layer of question. Is this our failure to educate people? In other words, why do we expect people to know such a sophisticated set of ideas as the four sets of laws of the universe and how they constrain our behavior, and that what adults are doing, right, or the patriarchy, which is adults, what the patriarchy or the adults are doing is they're saying, well, these laws of nature exist. You can't violate them without stealing from somebody, and stealing from somebody damages cooperation. So you can say, please take care of me because I'm not able to compete. You can say, don't punish me because I don't want to compete. Right? When compete means adapt. That's what it means. It means adapt. I said, don't take care of me if I can't adapt. Don't punish me if I'm not willing to adapt, but you're not too hard. And then give me the opportunity if I wish to adapt. Right? I mean, that's a pretty simple chain of reasoning. But is it impossible to tell people who have 80 IQs that this is the case? Of course not. It's like 4 laws of, I mean, it's not like you got to remember 26 characters, right? It's 4 laws of nature. They have these properties, right? And so we have to each of us has to do our best, and the amount of responsibility we can handle, which will increase through most of our lives. And then for those people who can't handle it, that's fine. And those people who don't want the responsibility, I always think of my fellow artists, because as I was explaining yesterday in some talk, I'd be perfectly happy to munch on hash brownies and paintings all the time, but for my addiction to hot chicks, which requires a lot of money. I had to go there again. But it's the self-realization that required for me to be able to say that was horrifying. Anyway, women are just really expensive, but I understand the checkout. Don't play a game, right? But then there's people who now let's say you don't want to check out, you want the gains, right? Then whatever class you're in, the laboring, which is non-transformative, it's basically cleaning up stuff, right? Working means you're transforming materials, right? The next level is managing, which is hard to. We think there's 2 kinds of managing: clerical and behavioral, right? So this is like being the sergeant, right? There's the managerial sergeant level. Then there's the clerical level, which is you're managing the resource inputs and the organization of inputs that go into the managing level, which is then transferred by the craftsman level, which is we call the working class, which is then shipped, moved around and whatever by the laboring class, right, or repaired by the laboring class. And then above that, you start to have the administrative class, which is the next level of clerisy, the entrepreneurial class, which is the one trying to figure out all the risks involved, the financial class, which is rallying capital resources, which is basically time to choose between how to do this, and above that, the political, and above that, the military class, right? I mean, these classes all do their job. Well, I mean, why is it hard to tell everybody that success is success within your rank? Your rank is determined by your responsibility. Your responsibility is determined partly by your ability, but also by your choice. How hard do you want to fucking work? I mean, for guys like us, I mean, it's not hard for me to work on conceptual shit all day long, right? It's not hard for some people to work with numbers all day long. I mean, accounting, right? It's the most tedious fucking thing in the world. But you talk to accountants, they love their job. I mean, a lot. See, they fucking love their job. It's puzzles, right? It's sort of like software developers. I love my job. It's puzzles. It's fucking hard. Right? So why can't people feel happy about success at their rank? Is there a reason why? In other words, is this a problem of education?
Well, because a lot of ranks don't garner success currently. They garner you destitution.
Right, and that's what I'm asking. Is there a way to overcome that?
And we've allowed the rank list to become elites as well. So
it's not a failure of education, it's a failure to punish miseducation. You can educate all you want, and if the next guy comes and tells them that you are oppressing him, and actually those limits don't exist.
So your point is that education is not a problem of positiva, it's a problem of negativa.
Yeah.
It's removing error, ignorance, and bias. I'm going to kiss you for that one. I don't want to kiss you very often, but right now I absolutely want to kiss and hug you for that.
Well, I'm worried about the meeting. Flat, dry humor. Just every time. All right, so that was. I'm going to be. That's another one. That insight, that formula, is education is the processes. Less so.
Or is it education or training? Yeah, anyway, same difference. The education is a process of removing our tendencies to engage in ignorance, error, bias, wishful thinking, deceit, and fraud. Right?
Well, I must refer to removing teachers that teach those things.
Well, I mean, this is again the interesting conflict is that teaching needs to be professionalized, and it's not, right? They haven't. The criteria for being a teacher is low. It's very low. I mean, these people are below journalists. I mean, in some cases, they're below what do you call them? The people who work in government that do social services. The teachers are a very low part of the teaching spectrum. Why aren't teachers required to have demonstrated life competency in order to teach? Because you can teach. We can identify a person with demonstrated life competency fairly easily. The ability to teach is actually a talent, not a right. And the amount of skill required is actually limited. What's really required is the talent and the demonstrated competency. On the other hand, I mean, why do we have teachers? Why do we have people who have teaching don't have fucking kids? That always really amazes me, right? Do I want to learn from the person who's learning about life, or do I want to learn the person who has succeeded in life? It doesn't matter what I'm learning, right? So, and also having people succeed in life prevents the capture of education by credentialists. The idea that you can get a PhD in education still fucking kills me. I mean, it's like getting a PhD in flushing toilets. I just don't fucking get it. I mean, it's just hysterical to me that there's this huge edifice of credentialism in the most joke profession that we have. And it's highly regulated, and it still doesn't do its fucking job. And it's just beyond me. Anyway, grandparents should teach. That way you wouldn't. Yeah, besides, you could teach that from like 55 to 65 or 70, right? That's a generation. And then you're out. Right? You're out. You don't have these people that are in this profession for so many years that they become numb to it. Instead, it's a celebration of your success in life, that you've been honored with the responsibility of educating children because of your demonstrated success with your own and others. You know, why isn't education paid as highly as lawyers are a bad example now? Because the income for lawyers is going to hit 60K, is going to drop to 60K soon. I mean, it's because there's so many of them. I've met a couple of poor lawyers lately, which has been kind of humorous. But the doctors is another good example. I mean, a doctor is a good thing. It's a higher risk thing. Why aren't teachers in the same sphere? Anyway, so did I get my point across there? Did I get that? So it's educable. We can do this, right? It's not impossible. People can be told that we can remove the utopian status nonsense that between the Enlightenment and the Marxists have brought about. People can still have all the opportunity for class rotation. We just as Martin says, eliminate false promises. And we can tell them what success means. And we can educate them for success. I'm trying to think of what would happen then. What would happen?
To who?
Well, I think what I'm running through the failure scenarios in my head by going through all the kids I went to high school with. Right? And so I'm like, well, the problem is that it's not always identifiable who's going to end up in the upper 1%.
No.
Right? And the problem is, in a space of 6 years, that's different.
Yes.
Right? When you're looking at a group of people across a 6-year set of grades, you can start to see that. But the problem is that because even then, I mean, a lot of guys, we don't sort of get our brains don't finish until we're 23 or 25 years old. Right? I mean, our brains, whereas a lot of girls, their brains are done by 19 or 20.
Yeah.
I was left, I paused just so somebody could throw something out there and nothing happened. I feel
I was going to extend your brain development to like 30. For a lot of dudes.
We talked a bit about how what we've been calling the bottom is actually the foundation.
Yes.
Right. One of the traits of a good foundation is it's stable.
Yes.
As you get higher up any hierarchy, it's going to become less stable. So that 1% will always be the least stable.
It's also way easier to fail.
Right. Exactly. But one of the things we miss in our current perception of a hierarchy is there ought not be any negative connotation going back down the hierarchy, back into further stability. If you're incapable of sustaining the stability above, then you just step back down into where you're once again stable. So there shouldn't be any. That's not a fault. That's a feature.
Right. There, argument that the wives of officers don't generally socialize with the wives of an enlisted. But is that true? And
yes, you really aren't supposed to even.
But is it true in the? No, I agree. Is it true in the class? Is it true in the class system that we tend to associate within our?
Yes.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. As far as I know, and that's because
the intuition of women doesn't scale beyond the herd size. They have to have the same intuition.
Yeah.
You were talking about female narcissists, right? They think everyone thinks and feels like them. They are the world, right? It expresses as solipsism. Where men like, you ought to think this way.
Yes.
Right.
How does that set of solutions change our female Jewish criticism into a positive restoration rather than a negative criticism? In other words, it's one thing to criticize the female intuition as it's integrated into the economy and polity in academy, and the Jewish intentional introgression and undermining using the female methods by baiting the female behaviors, which they intuit is correct, and our failure to sufficiently regulate or prohibit female antisocial behavior, which they don't see as antisocial. Right? They see our willingness to display dominance, expression, and aggression, and perhaps use light violence, or at least threats of force. They see we understand that those things can be legitimate, but they're higher risk, so we don't use them. Where women's antisocial behavior is the same kind of threat. It's social, GSSRM, undermining and self-reputation structure. But they don't see it as immoral. They don't see it as equivalent to male threats of violence.
They see themselves acting on behalf of the group.
Right. Whereas, what are we doing? We're oppressing by acting on part of the group. So they're oppressing, we're oppressing. So they don't see that. So does this take, which is providing people a path to victory, regardless of their traits, somewhat soften the criticism that the reason we're in this condition is a failure to regulate the female instinct, whether it's intellectually produced by the Jewish counter-revolution against the West, or it's by the susceptibility of women because they don't understand their intuitions as antisocial. Does that soften it at all? In other words, the solution versus the criticism.
Yeah, I think if we enable women to undermine each other with pointing out each other's antisocial behavior, the problem would be resolved very quickly.
Oh, good. That's 2 kisses you've got today.
That's too many.
That was fucking brilliant.
And I've never felt it was inherent to them being female, but more inherent to them failing to develop. And that's all correctable. So.
Okay, right. So what you're saying is there's a difference between blanketly criticizing female intuitions and blanket and then saying, well, the failure to mature those or develop those intuitions properly is the problem.
Yes.
In other words,
and that's what our enemies bait into hazard.
Right, they bait the female intuitions into the hazard of not developing.
Yes. And build structures and take over institutions to prevent that development, all that.
That's
You can properly and improperly apply violence. Shaming is a tool you can properly apply. Just like rallying is a tool you can properly apply.
Mm-hmm.
Or tactic.
So what's hard for them is it's so difficult for the female to tolerate truth, undesirable truth. Right? It's like the mansplaining versus womansplaining.
Because they're using.
They don't realize that there's a thing called womansplaining, right? Which is what they're doing when they're using all their denials of reality, which is equal to the mansplaining, which is what they mean by explaining something in detail that was really just an emotional exercise, right? They're missing those. The mansplaining and womansplaining exists. I'm sorry. Go ahead and complete your thought if I didn't make you lose it.
Oh, I was saying earlier that we're always acting on, if we're acting properly, right, and that in a violent behavior, you are acting on behalf of the group. You're acting so that an externality doesn't escape the individual situation.
Right.
The duel was to reduce that to actually, there's not a group problem. Like, it's a problem for you. So sort it out. We push things down so that the ways that females misuse it is they are defending themselves using the group, right? They are defending an individual preference. They are saving face and attempting to wield the group against you, as opposed to using it the proper way.
Which is?
To point out when someone is using that tactic in the improper way, right? To undermine them, their ability to use it to undermine the group.
So Martin's basically saying they peck their hens that peck each other to death no matter what. Give them the right stuff to peck each other to death over, and they'll be
make sure they kill the right hens.
That means the mean girls die, which is what we want. Right?
Well, what we found out through social media is that antisocial behavior is contagious, especially if it garnishes rewards.
Women have basically been told that they can have the status they want, which is as high as possible always, without having to adapt to some sort of norms of behavior.
Yep.
That they can act on worst of their intuitions and still get it all. So they do.
But so, yeah. Wow. Well, I mean, I think you're right. We can, just as we can enumerate for very simple people the 4 classes of rules and why you can't avoid them, we can enumerate how women lie, cheat, and steal, basically, mostly through GSSRM, and why they do it, such that other men and women can call them out on it. And we can re-institutionalize, because we used to do it, right? We can re-institutionalize female antisocial behavior, which of course women today consider oppression. When it's domestic civilizing, or what we call domestication. What a mad world we live in. Is this an interesting time? Or is this an, I don't know. I think it's an interesting time. It's interesting when you're like us and you know what the problem is and how to solve it.
Collapse of civilization tends to be an interesting time.
Interesting time. All right. So a couple of things. So we addressed the education issue, that it's possibly addressed. that the class issue can probably address, and he lastly said, does the class fixing the class education issue fix the female introgression of female undermining? I think so. So all of these things are relatively easy to fix, and we could, and honestly, could probably do them through what did I call them earlier? The cartoons.
Schoolhouse Rock.
Schoolhouse Rock. I mean, they're that kind of public service announcement level of thing that can be just be, and after 10 years, it's everybody knows it, right?
Oh, social science is the universal education. Social science, the science of care and cooperation. Then you scale on top of that. So by 12, you should know the stuff we're saying it's easy to fix. That's why it's easy to fix, because you should be able to learn it by 12. So if you can't reintegrate it, you are dysfunctional.
So we've just in this discussion we've talked about the problem, so basically dissolution and failure. That was class. We talk about education. We talk about class, and how class can be used as rank and how to make people successful in their rank. We talk about the Jewish female problem of integration of this new cult that takes advantage of the hole in our law and our institutions. And although for the sake of the audience, I'll reiterate that our laws used to protect us against female antisocial behavior. But what's happened is that because of the rapidity of the growth of European civilization over the past, especially 350, 400 years, and especially since the Industrial Revolution, what's happened is that men invented new ways of criminality that we focused on in our law, and we took the female for granted. One of the holes in our Constitution is it doesn't state the common law directly. It does in the Declaration, but it doesn't state it directly, and so it implies it. And unlike our work, which fully articulates it, it leaves open this problem of of the common law accounted for the problem of female antisocial behavior, but code law, which is largely commercial, does not include the sufficient suppression of female antisocial, anti-political, basically warfare, social, anti-political, and essentially female methods of warfare that are a natural bias of the Jews, Muslims, and women. Okay, so is that correct? So I mean, we have a hole there that we can correct. But then educationally, we can also supply the education system to fix all this antisocial behavior that's leading to what Luke keeps bringing up is the failure of maturity, which I really like that. I really like that just as much as I really like Martin's comment there. So we've satisfied all those things. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that ties it up. Now, the only question remaining, which to finish the before, during, and after, what is the enemy going to do if we try to normalize this?
Scream oppression.
Are they just going to, they're left with lie and deny, right?
Yes, yeah, they're left with lie.
There's no argument left, so they're left with
one of the nuances in there I just don't want to miss. I've talked in the past about technology, especially social technology, being creating a buffer between us and nature's feedback, right? I think even before we started dismissing the potential for women to be antisocial, we were increasing the gap for the female between them and nature faster than we did for males.
Correct.
So they've been under that detached position, meaning they weren't getting the pressure from nature to adapt, to mature, to develop, right? And we didn't introduce adequate proxies to ensure their adaptation and maturation and development, right? And we started doing that for women far earlier than we did for men.
Right.
So I don't know that we've seen a mature woman in general for, a couple thousand years. And I think for men, it's
interesting. Now, so
500 years or 1,000 years behind that.
Take. I'm not sure. I'd have to. Okay, if you go back for 300 years or 400 years, you're right. Right. I'm trying to take that back to, is that true prior to agrarianism? And I can't tell. Probably.
We saw a lot of these same behaviors in Greek and Roman times.
Right, but I'm trying to go to
There are
prior
records
to,
about 'em.
you said, okay, oh, so you're saying just for 1,000 years, a couple,
I said a couple
probably.
thousand years.
That's probably right. That's probably true.
I have doubts about their maturity before then. Even
Well, I mean,
in
women had to be very
times.
pragmatic. The problem is, until you get agrarianism, you don't get the problem of property, assets, capital.
Right.
And once capital's in progress, women have to be more accountable because that's what marriage does, right? Women have to be more accountable. And the argument is women were free before agrarianism because they didn't have to be accountable, right? They could have their children and export their costs on the extended family and tribe and brand. Whereas under agrarianism,
To the degree that extended family would tolerate
yes,
or
exactly.
abide it.
Well, the way they handled is they just fucking indiscriminately and left their children out to die.
Right.
That's why I say there's been more murders by women of children
It was a
than there have by
self-correction.
men in war.
Genetic correction.
Yes. So unfortunately, babies don't leave a lot of archaeological record, especially when you just leave them out for things to eat. But once you got the agrarianism, and this is probably a good analysis, is when we demanded more responsibility from women for their children in the capital. And it's true that the women have been complaining against this through all the recorded history, because they don't want to be responsible. Well, I mean, so what we did, which is your argument, is we haven't had a responsible. Well, we've had a woman. We haven't had. The question is, are we just removing female responsibility and returning them to normal licentious state? Search appears to be the happening, right? Which we're saying is maturity.
Well, what I'm also saying is that nature would kill the irresponsible female. So first we had to overcome that.
No, I don't think that's true. I think under agrarianism, I'm not sure nature kills the irresponsible female.
They never existed apart from men.
Exactly.
Even in the most primitive tribes that exist today, we observe marriage.
Right, I understand that. But the men were also out hunting for long periods of time.
Some men, right?
Yeah.
They don't leave the women alone. You have
That's
a
a good
band.
idea.
I mean, if that's one of the criteria for success.
Right,
Or
but
movement-
they
hold on,
also
let me-
existed
let
at
me-
a time where threats were ever present. They didn't get to shut the door, lock the door, and have the police keep the bad guys away. There were threats where every creature out there could kill you. All your enemy tribes were out to kill you. I mean, the threats were ever present. So
Yeah, I'm sorry, Luke. Now we're disambiguating nature, like external from man, from the succeeding as a member of a group of people without being ostracized, left behind, or sacrificed, or killed, whatever, enslaved, sold into slavery. All right.
Still, for women to avoid those dangers, it mostly required obeying what men told them.
So are we saying something horrible here? Is that women are that women are naturally irresponsible?
Yeah, but all humans are naturally irresponsible, anxious, and idiotic, right, until you accumulate enough knowledge and ability to steward others. Right? Most men aren't fit. We don't mature most males.
right.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm just trying to get to how resistant.
If all the capable people are aligned behind increasing capability of those who are not, they can't say no.
Right.
They can say no. They can
Right,
revolt, right, and throw a tantrum. They can say no, but
Look, the problem is that, again, I come back to this freaking issue: is why do we put up with women's behavior?
Right.
I
Well,
just don't get it. I don't. I mean, I really want to understand that, because I actually don't. I mean, I don't understand why women can do shit that we would never allow a man to do without cleaning the floor with them.
Because
Right.
we're no longer allowed to punish them, and at this point, we're not even
Yeah, but
allowed
we
to
didn't even
check
do it
them.
in the past. mean, I might get angry with you and say, control your daughter or control your wife, but I didn't touch yours.
It happens for the same reason men can't control each other anymore. We have disparate peoples living in close proximity, so you don't have the norms that can be applied. We can't punch each other because we lost those norms. Women can't correct each other because they lost those norms.
Well, those are true statements.
You're not going to see the Karen calling out the loud, angry black woman in the grocery store.
Those
are going to happen.
Those are truths. But what's the first principle? Why is it that in general, men tend not to, there's military rape and all the other stuff, but tend not to discipline in-group women, right? Unless they have they're directly responsible for them. Why is that?
Well, of course, you're not punishing my wife. That's my property. It's my responsibility.
Another man would harm you.
What?
Another man would harm you.
Yeah, well, that's the answer, right? Yeah, but why do we do that? Well, the answer is really obvious. Is that what two things do we genetically defend? Our mates and our offspring. Well, the weird thing is when you realize we defend our offspring more than our mates, which is obvious in retrospect.
Well, because all women do.
What?
I said all women do, and then if some men do, that's most.
That's most. Well, no, even men. Men will defend their children.
Yes, most men do too. Yes, most men do too.
So, which is fascinating to me.
Oh.
I mean, gorillas do it. I mean, really
achieved genetic success is better than potential genetic success.
Yeah. So bizarre how obvious it all is. All right, so if everything else is an outgrowth of that,
right.
The first, right, that first thing. The second thing is what will men most likely kill for? Women, right? So access to women. So okay, so all this is a normalization of a very primitive first cause. Okay.
And going back to how do we get this across, right? I mean, my take on it is I'm not asking men to be something other than men, and I'm not asking women to be something other than women. I'm asking both of them to grow the hell up.
Yeah. Well, that's the issue. What's the left's promise? You don't have to go.
Right, exactly. That is the big
because we will take care of you.
Yeah.
You want to know what oppression is? It's seduction.
Right. It's those of us that want everybody to grow up versus those of us that don't want anyone to grow up. And not growing up is going to get everybody killed.
It appears to be.
Because it's the grown-ups that are the buffer between you and nature.
Okay, so you're providing. We're trying to. My question in step 3 was, can we get out of this claim that women are intrinsically evil because we failed to what's happening at this point is we failed to suppress female antisocial behavior as much as male, and that's just a time lag thing because of the difference in empowerment between the sexes.
Yes.
And then the second thing is, how are they going to respond? Well, they can only respond by lying and denying and hysterics, which is what they use, right? Yeah. Lying, denying, hysterics.
They can throw a tantrum.
And so that's really it. But part of the value of this conversation has been, I've been stressed for a couple of years now about, well, I mean, the truth is what we stated. It's our law used to accommodate for any social behavior. We scaled up the sophistication of the polity and the division of labor and then our numbers, and especially with communication, we've scaled up our ability to commit crimes, new kinds of crimes, and especially with communication and academy and education, we scaled up the ability for women to create social crimes. And what they're doing is scaling up their social crimes. And there's just a lag in our law preventing the female antisocial behavior to the same degree we prohibit male antisocial behavior. Yeah. Well, that's just obvious to us, right? But I mean, does that sound like, oh, it's oppression, you domestic, you're just making an excuse to oppress women? I mean, tell me what method of oppression we're using that isn't just preventing you from stealing. And I don't understand how where you're getting oppression from. How do you distinguish oppression from domestication? And what's the difference between domestication and pacification? And what's the difference between pacification, domestication, and in the middle of decriminalization? I mean, it's all the same fucking thing. We're trying to get you to stop imposing costs on others by your irresponsibility. And you're saying there was adulthood is responsibility, which is oppression. And we're like, it's not oppression, it's domestication. In other words, if you don't want to be domesticated, get the fuck out. Right? I mean, it's not complicated. But do we get ourselves out of that trap is what I'm asking.
What I'm still hearing here is putting same expectations on women as on men. And I think if we do that and allow women to trade that for submission to some male authority in exchange for that man having responsibility, a lot of them would do it voluntarily.
Right, I agree. So what does that mean then?
Why not let them do that, right? Let husbands be responsible for wives once again.
Yeah, I don't think an adult male and an adult female are the same thing. So I don't have the same expectations for both.
Yeah,
I just expect them both to grow up.
right. It's not. Well, let me push back on that. You expect them to have both wield the equal responsibility within their domains of competency.
Yes.
That's a different thing. Those aren't equal, right?
Right. They do not share the same domain of competence.
Yeah, but that's the problem. Then we're talking about two different things and calling both of them adulthood.
Well,
I think most animals show a adult version of the male and an adult version of the female, and there's distinctions between them. So I think there's an adult version of human female. So I think that's possible to exist.
Yeah, that's in animals we would just be referring to sexual maturity.
They exhibit different behaviors.
Yes.
Well, I think we offer that bar for the behavioral suite, meaning the adaptation that we're asking for, that we've gotten in the sciences beforehand that led us to the industrial age and so on. We're asking for a behavioral modification from people. We're asking for reciprocity. That denotes maturity.
To some degree, we're demanding reciprocity.
We're telling you that God commands it, and we're gonna listen to Him. So work it out any way you like.
Okay, somebody's going to think we're doing rules. God, nature's God, same fucking, rules, laws of the universe, same fucking thing. We're saying we don't have a choice but this.
Reality's gonna fully account.
I'm not going to tolerate your thefts.
Reality is going to fully account. If you don't, it will equilibrate in time.
Why should you, if you eschew responsibility? This goes back to Martin's question. If you eschew responsibility, you say, I don't want to be responsible. I want to hand over that responsibility, right?
Yes, but now you have to obey.
What?
At least. Yes, but now you have to obey.
Well, that let me ask you that. That's a positiva. But do you have to obey, or do you have to, in other words, or do you have to simply not do wrong? Those are two different.
It depends where you're participating.
I'm not sure that's
I'm not sure the context. If you hand off responsibility to someone, like woman handing off responsibility to a man. Now,
yeah, but which responsibility, the positive or the negative? When we mean so, I mean, we can enumerate all rights. All rights are enumerated equally. Everything else on top, a right is a privilege, right? It's something, or as privilege. So that's a difference between a right and a privilege. A privilege is something that is not totally reciprocal, right? So the right to your sovereignty and But I mean, when we say that there's a new right, obligation, and alienation, that isn't always something that's constructed by the positiva. That's not a right. That's a privilege, obligation, and an alienation. Right. So there's fundamental rights, which are equal to all of us, right? And then there's privileges. Privileges might be. I've struggled with that word, but it seems to be the reason it's a struggle is maybe useful, is that a privilege is a thing where we, in exchange for additional responsibility, we have additional privileges, obligations, and alienations. So I don't know if there's the reason I'm asking this, Martin, is I'm not sure that requiring women to adhere to fundamental rights doesn't just cut them out of politics.
They get a
In other
say.
words,
Explain
because
that.
politics isn't negativa, it's positiva, right? It's an assertion that you are required to fulfill these contract obligations, but that doesn't mean you're in other words, that just deprives you of the ability to exert force. It doesn't deprive you of a responsibility for not doing harm. I'm waiting for Martin.
Well, in today I was suggesting the man could bear responsibility for his woman doing harm because he was
So
supposed to.
just as I could say, I don't want. Okay, so I'm saying that there's
It's
no.
like,
I'm running with it because you got a point here, right? Because
I just want to say that it's the same relationship we already have with children.
right. So you could sign over, because we have this is already in our law. You could sign over responsibility.
Yes.
But then now you're subject to that authority. Right. Well, what's slavery? Indentured servitude. Well, that's exactly what it is. You're obligated to give me food, shelter, and care in exchange for the right to direct all my labors. So that's a transfer of responsibility, right? It's an exchange of responsibility. What you're saying is that, well, here's the problem, Mark. I'm not comfortable with men having involuntary responsibility. In other words, responsibility for anyone else without that person saying, I want you to have that responsibility.
I'm not saying everyone must do it this way. I'm suggesting
It's possible.
way it should be available.
Right. Well, what is one? So my argument would be, what is one man equals one household, one vote? How does that differ from what you're saying? I don't think it does. Because I'm only interested in the political. I mean, the question here is political, economic, and strategic. Right? It's the right of positivas, which is the application of political force. So I'm just trying to. I'm not seeing your lights go on this, so I'm trying to see if I'm making my point. One family, one vote, which is one man, one vote, is essentially the female's surrender of political responsibility to the husband.
Voting isn't all of it. It's who's responsible when you impose a cost. Are you responsible, or have you offloaded that responsibility onto someone and you are responsible to him?
Well, this is what I get to. If you, which responsibility? A political responsibility or a fundamental responsibility? In other words, a harm. If somebody does a harm, you can't offload the responsibility. Because that becomes a court matter for the court, right? Public to prosecute. Now, though, you could say as a man, I'll take care of this. I'll absorb responsibility for policing this control. Well, we do that already. We don't do it as much as we used to, but we do that. That's in part of our law. is the fact that I'll take responsibility for this person. Now, we have plenty of mechanisms for doing that already. We don't use them as much as we used to, but we have legal, the terms are escaping me at the moment. Because I'm watching Luke's light flicker and he turns between a ghost and a man every now and then. It's just rough. But we have those vehicles for assignation of responsibility for things. And you used to be able to say to the court, I'll take responsibility for this person's act. So if you're saying we should restore that ability, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
It's a very good line of thinking. Right.
I gotta head out soon, guys. I got family stuff coming up here. So.
Okay, well, we're gone to about 2 hours. All right, so I think this is a really interesting discussion. I got a lot of value out of it. There's a bunch of notes I could take, principles I could copy. So thank you for our special Thanksgiving, Thursday, November 24th edition of the Natural Law Institute staff meeting. And I hope you guys have a great Turkey Day. Love all of you, and this was really good. Yes?
Yeah. Thanks for the chat.
Like, subscribe, bell, comment.